On a routine overnight flight, a black woman boards first class carrying nothing but her quiet confidence and a boarding pass that promises comfort and respect. Yet from the moment she settles into her seat, she becomes the target of a silent but ruthless campaign to erase her presence, reduce her worth, and push her into invisibility. No explanation is given, no apology offered. Passengers watch in uncomfortable silence as the boundaries of privilege are enforced with cold precision. But beneath her calm exterior lies a secret powerful enough to turn the entire flight, and everyone on it, upside down. This is a story about more than just a seat on a plane. It's about how prejudice hides in plain sight and how one woman's quiet strength threatens to expose the truth behind the facade. If you're drawn to stories that unravel injustice with unexpected twists and relentless tension, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? Your voice helps bring these stories to life. Aurelia's boots were quiet against the polished floor as she stepped into first class. Her coat, crisp and tailored, moved with her like shadow. She wasn't flashy, no designer purse, no oversized sunglasses, no dramatic flair, but she carried herself with a practiced confidence. The boarding process had been smooth. Her seat was clearly printed on her boarding pass. Two-way. She located it easily and placed her small carry-on above, without help. Settling in, she gave no notice to the few glances aimed her way. Most were fleeting. One or two lingered. She ignored them all. Aurelia leaned back, quietly surveying the rows of cushioned leather and overhead lights shaped like halos. The hum of idle conversation barely reached her ears. She didn't expect comfort, just silence. Just space. She had earned it. Every hour of overtime. Every overnight flight logged for field inspections. Every grueling review and emergency audit. Her phone buzzed gently. A message lit the screen. San Francisco confirmed. Briefing 0800. See you there. She clicked it off. That's when she saw the approach. Mila, all confidence and control in a starch-pressed uniform. Heels sharp as punctuation, strode down the aisle like she was born to patrol it. Her eyes landed on Aurelia, and something in her jaw tightened. Aurelia knew that look. It was subtle, an almost imperceptible flick of doubt. Not unfamiliar. Mila stopped beside her. "Good evening," she said, not unkindly, but with a stiffness that suggested she didn't like what she was about to say. "May I see your boarding pass?" Aurelia reached calmly into her coat pocket and handed over. Mila barely glanced at the seat number before her smile vanished. "There's been a change," she said quickly. "This seat was reassigned. You'll need to relocate." Aurelia frowned. "I wasn't notified of any reassignment. This ticket was purchased weeks ago." Mila's tablet emerged from behind her back. She tapped again. Her brows furrowed, then rose. "Yes, well, the system made a last-minute update. These things happen." She didn't look up as she said it. Aurelia didn't raise her voice. "I'm not sure that's correct. I confirmed this seat this morning." "I'm sure you did," Mila said, brushing aside the comment. "But we need to move you to another seat now. We're on a tight schedule." Aurelia didn't move. She kept her voice measured. "Why me?" Mila finally made eye contact. "Excuse me. Why am I being asked to move?" "Ma'am, please don't make this difficult. We don't want to delay." "I'm not making anything difficult. I just want to understand." The man in 2C shifted in his seat, clearly annoyed. "Is this going to be a thing?" he muttered. Mila smiled politely at him, then turned to Aurelia with growing impatience. "Ma'am, your new seat is 36B. It's still on this flight, of course. We just need to reseat you due to some protocol involving." "Well, it doesn't matter. Please gather your things." Aurelia exhaled quietly. She reached up, unlatched the overhead bin, and retrieved her bag. The motion was slow, deliberate. Her face didn't betray frustration, only a weary resignation. As she stepped into the aisle, several passengers averted their eyes. A few pretended to check their phones. One woman in 1D leaned toward her husband and whispered something. He chuckled. The walk down the aisle felt endless. Every row was a verdict. Every face a silent jury. She kept her gaze straight ahead as she passed row after row of indifferent passengers. The curtain to coach snapped open at her approach and snapped closed behind her as if sealing off a crime scene. Row 36 was near the very back. Her new seat was wedged between a teenager bobbing his head to loud music and an older man who was already snoring. There was a stale smell in the air, popcorn maybe, or old socks. Aurelia sat down, placing her bag beneath the seat in front of her. The cushion was thin. The air vent rattled faintly. She looked out the small porthole window and saw only wing and darkness. Her phone buzzed again. This time she ignored it. She closed her eyes and leaned her head back. The tray table in front of Aurelia bore deep scratches and a dried smear of something orange-red along the edge. She stared straight ahead, not in protest, not in despair, but in discipline. Her body refused to slouch even here, in this cast-off corner of the aircraft. The scent of cold fries wafted from 3 rows ahead. She ignored it. Instead, her mind began cataloging the details of what had just occurred, every dismissive glance, every subtle dig. She wasn't unfamiliar with this breed of humiliation, but there had been something almost performative about what Mila had done. Like the point wasn't just to move her, but to erase her entirely. In the front of the plane, Mila basked in the calm glow of first class, walking the aisle with performative grace as she topped off glasses of sparkling wine and handed out hot towels with 2 fingers and a charming wink. To anyone watching, she was the ideal hostess, attentive, confident, polished. But underneath, she simmered with quiet satisfaction. The discomfort of having Aurelia, a woman who didn't look the part, seated in premium space, had been efficiently resolved. She felt proud of the way she'd handled it. Firm but fair. She had done her job, or so she told herself. An hour into the flight, Mila stood in the galley with her 2 attendants, gossiping behind the curtain. "She gave me attitude," Mila said with a shake of her head. "Had that tone, you know the type. Like she was daring me to follow the rules." Kelsey, the younger of the 2, shifted uncomfortably. She didn't meet Mila's eye. "She didn't seem rude," Kelsey said softly. "Just firm." Mila gave her a long look. "You're new. You'll learn. This job isn't just about coffee and peanuts. It's about order." And that woman was chaos walking in heels. She chuckled at her own joke, and the senior attendant beside her laughed too, though more out of allegiance than amusement. Back in 36B, Aurelia reached into her bag and pulled out a small, hardbound notebook with a leather strap holding it closed. Her fingers moved over the spine slowly, but she didn't open it. Instead, she sat perfectly still as a flight attendant finally appeared and began distributing a cart of drinks. When the cart reached row 36, the attendant looked down at Aurelia, blinked once, and said flatly, "Water." Aurelia nodded. The plastic cup she received was warm and half full. The ice bucket was already empty. She accepted it silently. The attendant moved on without another word. Aurelia lifted the cup to her lips, sipped once, and placed it gently in the holder. Her movements were measured, her expression unreadable. She was not surprised. The point had never been the water. It was always about signaling status. This was a performance, and she had been cast as the unworthy guest, the intruder in a carefully curated world. And the audience had applauded the moment she was removed. In first class, Mila entertained again, recounting the story to the man in 2C, who had been watching it all with thinly veiled enjoyment. "She looked at me like I owed her something," Mila said with a laugh. "Like she couldn't believe I was asking her to move. I told her we all follow the same rules." The man smirked. "Yeah, but not everyone buys the same kind of ticket, do they?" He chuckled at his own quip, and Mila joined in. "Exactly," she said. "Some people just don't fit." Kelsey stood a few rows back, folding napkins and pretending not to listen, but her ears burned. Later, as cabin service wound down, a small ripple of laughter floated from first class. Someone made a joke about coach peacocks, passengers who dress up and pretend they belong in first class until the real ones arrive. Mila played along, mocking Aurelia's posture and tone. She sat so straight, like she thought it made her entitled to the seat. "I've seen that trick before." The laughter returned. No one questioned the cruelty. No one objected. The comfort of conformity was too warm. Meanwhile, turbulence struck, not severe, but enough to jolt the trays and darken the cabin. In 36B, Aurelia reached for her armrest, keeping her spine straight even as others slouched or grabbed wildly. Her breathing slowed. She took in the murmurs around her. A child whimpered 2 rows back. The man beside her snorted awake, muttering an apology as his elbow bumped hers. She didn't respond. The captain's voice broke through the speaker, advising calm and predicting clearer skies soon. The seatbelt sign stayed lit. Mila returned to her station, smoothing her blouse, adjusting her badge. She glanced at her own reflection in the small galley mirror and whispered under her breath, "Handled." Her body was physically present in economy, surrounded by the banal rhythm of an overnight flight, but her mind replayed every detail with forensic precision. She had been removed, dismissed, and reclassified like cargo rerouted mid-shipment, and the entire performance was rehearsed, efficient, unflinching, cruel in its confidence. What disturbed her wasn't just Mila Keene's arrogance, but how easily the cabin had accepted it. This was not a mistake. It was theater. Mila had played the enforcer, the guardian of class and control, and the audience rewarded her with validation. Now the curtain had closed and the scene had shifted, but the play continued. In the galley up front, Mila stood with one hand resting on her hip, sipping ginger ale from a champagne flute. She didn't drink alcohol on flights, too many calories, not enough control. Her voice floated over the buzz of the aircraft as she leaned into a conversation with one of the off-duty pilots hitching a ride home in 1A. She thought attitude would save her, Mila said, tapping the rim of her glass with a painted fingernail. Acted like I owed her something. I don't play that. The pilot chuckled, amused. Well, you handled it. It's always the ones who think they're owed everything who blow up first. Mila grinned. Exactly. It's never the people who belong who push back. The real first-class passengers just nod and smile. She spoke with the ease of someone who had drawn these lines before, not in chalk, but in ink. Permanent, decisive, invisible only to those who refuse to see them. Meanwhile, in the dim glow of coach, Aurelia closed her notebook and placed it carefully back into her bag. The temperature had dropped slightly, or maybe it only felt colder now that her internal fury had settled into a controlled freeze. Her breath came steadily, though each inhale felt heavier than the last. The man beside her snored again, this time louder, and the sound grated against her composure. She turned slightly toward the window, watching the moonlit curvature of the engine wing and letting its mechanical whine blur her thoughts. The plane dipped slightly through turbulence, and Aurelia's hand instinctively braced against the seat in front of her, fingers splaying just enough to steady her posture. She thought again about the way Mila had said the word confusion, how it wasn't just about a seat, but about a person. How Mila had spoken with the full confidence of a gatekeeper, one who knew that rules didn't apply equally and wielded authority not to protect passengers, but to curate the experience for the few she deemed worthy. An hour later, as most of the cabin slept or stared mindlessly at their screens, Mila reappeared near row 35 under the pretense of checking seatbelts and trash collection. Her posture remained tight, her gait purposeful. When she reached Aurelia's row, she paused slightly, casting a quick glance down at her as if to confirm that Aurelia remained in her assigned place. No words were exchanged, but the gesture said enough. You've been seen, you've been categorized, and you've been dismissed. Mila continued down the aisle, never breaking stride, disappearing back behind the curtain that still hung like a veil between worlds. Kelsey, the younger attendant, hovered nearby as well, her eyes darting occasionally toward Aurelia, but never for too long. She seemed torn, as though her conscience pulled in one direction and her job description in another. Earlier that evening, she had read through the passenger manifest while restocking the cart and noticed something that had unsettled her. Aurelia Shaw's ticket had no record of reassignment. There was no error, no glitch, just a manual override initiated from Mila's own login. The detail haunted her. It wasn't an accident. It was personal. Back in her seat, Aurelia finally allowed her mind to drift, not into sleep, but into memory. She remembered the last diversity review she had conducted in a private aviation firm where the CEO had insisted unconscious bias didn't exist, even as he struggled to remember the name of the only black woman on his executive team. She remembered a federal conference where a senior officer had suggested she must be the event planner because he didn't expect someone like her to lead training. She remembered being told to smile more during a keynote on crisis response. And yet none of those slights had felt quite like this one, not because it was the most brutal, but because it had been so seamless, so practiced, so immune to consequence. This wasn't just authority. This was ritualized exclusion disguised as procedure. The lights flickered briefly during a scheduled systems check, and Aurelia felt her fingers twitch. She was trained in safety operations. She had taught simulation protocols. She could read cockpit logs in her sleep. But here, she was just another seat number in the back, one that didn't deserve acknowledgement, let alone apology. The injustice didn't hurt because it was new. It hurt because it was familiar. And still, she said nothing, because silence, for now, was the only shield she had. Not submission, not defeat, just preservation. In the crew cabin, Mila prepared her final report. She logged the incident as minor seating adjustment due to last-minute security priority. She marked the log with a neutral tag and filed it. She didn't hesitate. There would be no follow-up, no flags, no questions. The system, after all, trusted its own. As she hit submit, a message popped up briefly, just a confirmation. Then the screen went blank. Mila leaned back in her seat, confident she had extinguished any spark of conflict before it could ignite. She would sleep well. Silence from attendants who had helped. Silence from systems designed to obscure bias under the veneer of protocol. Injustice had not needed a loud voice. It had needed only the nods and shrugs of passive witnesses to solidify its grip. And now, as the flight progressed, Aurelia felt the full weight of that silence pressing in from all sides. She was not simply seated among strangers. She was surrounded by silent accomplices. Across the aisle, a woman scrolled through her phone, having recorded Aurelia's forced removal from first class. She hadn't spoken up. She hadn't objected. But she had filmed it, not for justice, but for curiosity, maybe even entertainment. 2 rows ahead, a middle-aged man who had watched the exchange with quiet amusement was now replaying the footage, chuckling under his breath and showing it to his seatmate with an exaggerated whisper. She really thought she belonged up there. The other man snorted. They always do, then act surprised when it doesn't last. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp, carving itself deep into the fuselage of that moment. Back in the galley, Mila Keen leaned against the counter, sipping from a bottle of mineral water. The air around her relaxed and smug. She scrolled through her service checklist, ticked off boxes, and exchanged idle gossip with another attendant named Carla. She's still sitting there with her arms crossed like she's waiting for justice to board at 30,000 feet, Mila quipped. Carla smirked. Think she'll file a complaint? Let her, Mila replied. People like her file them all the time. They never stick. It's their hobby. Carla laughed harder than the joke deserved. It wasn't about humor. It was about allegiance. Aurelia, meanwhile, took in every detail. The hushed laughter, the side glances, the way people now avoided eye contact with her, as if her presence had become radioactive. She opened her notebook again, not to write, but to remind herself she still held the truth. Her fingers grazed the page as her mind replayed every movement, every word Mila had spoken. She didn't just remember the facts. She remembered the tone, the pauses, the glances exchanged between crew members. She remembered the sequence, the choreography of power as it unfolded with seamless cruelty. Then she noticed a flicker of something different. Kelsey, the youngest attendant, passed her row again, this time slowing slightly. Her eyes met Aurelia's for a fraction of a second before darting away. It wasn't pity. It was discomfort, recognition, maybe even guilt. Aurelia held the gaze as long as she could, anchoring herself in the only moment of visible humanity she'd been offered since her removal. Kelsey disappeared down the aisle, flustered, face taut. In the galley, she asked Mila if she could take a break. Mila rolled her eyes but waved her off. "Just don't get sentimental," she called after her. Kelsey entered the staff rest nook and closed the curtain behind her, the thin fabric muffling the sound of first-class laughter. She pulled out her own phone and opened the crew dashboard. There, under passenger incident logs, she reviewed the entry Mila had filed. Passenger moved due to system alert. Security flag recommended economy reassignment. Kelsey frowned. She tapped into the flag report, expecting a red icon, a code, something. Instead, she found no such tag. No flag. No reassignment trigger. Just Mila's manual entry timestamped 15 minutes before boarding. Her breath caught. Her fingers hovered. She knew now. It had been personal, deliberate, and she had stood there and done nothing. Her hand trembled slightly as she clicked the screen off. Outside the rest nook, the world continued spinning under the illusion of order. Mila was now telling a story about a man who had once tried to sue the airline because his champagne had been too warm. Her audience of two laughed dutifully. Their amusement had little to do with the story and everything to do with staying on Mila's side. Authority attracts allegiance, even unearned. Especially unearned. In economy, Aurelia closed her notebook. She knew her name wouldn't appear in the report the way it should. Mila would bury the truth under codes and phrasing designed to sound neutral. Words like disturbance and compliance and miscommunication. She had seen it before. She had taught seminars on it. But the real documentation, the one that mattered, was happening in her mind and possibly silently inside Kelsey's conscience. The woman across the aisle who had recorded the earlier scene finally uploaded the video to a private group chat, captioned, "This lady thought she owned the plane, LOL." Within seconds, the message was being forwarded. By the end of the flight, it would be shared hundreds of times. Another fragment of someone else's humiliation recycled for amusement. Aurelia knew about these digital rituals. She had written white papers on social complicity in racialized public shaming. She had seen firsthand how quickly an audience becomes part of the performance. But now she was the subject, not a researcher. Around her, the passengers had mostly begun dozing, lulled by routine and their own emotional distance from the spectacle they had witnessed. No one had questioned Mila Keene's authority. No one had paused to ask whether what they saw had been just. They had absorbed it as entertainment or background noise, then moved on, their silence a currency spent in exchange for remaining undisturbed. Aurelia knew this pattern well, not just from her own life, but from the patterns she had studied and written about, the cycles of erasure disguised as order. But theory and application diverged sharply when you were the target, the example made. And tonight, she wasn't the observer. She was the object. In the galley, Mila sat back with her shoes off and her feet perched on the edge of a supply cart, sipping tea from a porcelain mug she had brought from home. "She's still awake," she said to Carla, who leaned against the counter with a protein bar in hand. "She hasn't moved, hasn't spoken. It's like she's waiting for something, or judging everyone." Carla nodded lazily. Some people think quiet means power, but all it means is that they're bitter and passive-aggressive. She'll probably write an angry email and forget it by morning. Mila smirked. "Let her. You think someone like her gets traction with corporate? Please. They'll send a 20% off voucher and call it a day." They laughed together, a sound more sharp than warm, reverberating through the thin partition that barely separated them from the very people they served. Back in her seat, Aurelia's mind dissected every word, every expression, every tactical move made since the moment she had stepped onto the plane. What had first stung as personal now revealed itself as professional, an orchestration of bias, structure, and hierarchy. Mila wasn't just a petty enforcer. She was a conductor in a symphony of microaggressions, directing a performance where cruelty wore a polished smile and protocol shielded malice from scrutiny. But what chilled Aurelia more than Mila's behavior was the ease with which everyone else harmonized. The woman who filmed her, the men who whispered behind her, the attendants who watched and said nothing. They were not anomalies. They were integral to the function of power, passive but essential, like insulation in a wall built to contain shame. When the second beverage service began, Aurelia was deliberately skipped. Not once, but twice. The cart came down her row, paused at 35C, then resumed at 37A. Her polite request for tea was met with a tight-lipped, "We're out," though she could see clearly the steaming kettle on the shelf behind the cart. She said nothing. The woman in 36C next to her looked momentarily uncomfortable, but quickly turned away, pretending not to notice. It was easier that way. Aurelia shifted slightly, not in defiance, but to reclaim what little dignity she could in a seat designed to reduce a person to numbers. Then came the final push. Mila walked slowly through coach with a clipboard in hand, pausing every few rows and exchanging words with selected passengers. She asked about their flight, offered thanks, performed warmth like a trained actress on her last tour. When she reached 36B, she paused longer, as if considering whether Aurelia deserved the same courtesy. "Everything all right?" she asked finally, loud enough for others to hear. Aurelia raised her eyes, measured and unreadable. "Fine." Mila tilted her head, as if trying to peer deeper into a specimen. "I want to make sure there are no misunderstandings," she said. "We operate strictly by procedure. I hope you understand that." Her voice oozed false concern, the kind that demands submission disguised as clarity. Aurelia didn't blink. "Of course," she said. "You've made that very clear." There was no smile. Mila didn't like the tone, but she couldn't challenge it without revealing her own. She moved on. Minutes later, a woman 2 rows behind asked why the black woman near the rear hadn't received service. The attendant deflected smoothly. She declined earlier. "We don't want to push service on passengers who prefer not to be disturbed." The lie slid easily from her lips, practiced and gentle, like all lies in uniforms designed to look like truth. Aurelia heard it. Her fingers closed slowly into a fist on her lap, then released. In the crew cabin, Kelsey sat quietly, her stomach turning. She had rechecked the system after her break and confirmed what she suspected. Aurelia had no flags, no notes, no behavior warnings. The incident log Mila submitted was full of language that subtly implied noncompliance, without explicitly stating anything actionable. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic evasion. Kelsey had seen this play out before in different forms, but never so clearly, and never with a subject so composed, so precise in her silence. She wanted to say something, but what? And to whom? Mila had seniority. Carla would side with her no matter what, and corporate would bury it like they always did, until a lawsuit or a scandal forced them to care. Still, her conscience began whispering louder than her fear. As the cabin darkened for final rest, Mila walked through one last time and paused near Aurelia. "Just a reminder, we'll be descending in an hour. Please secure your belongings." Her words were bland, but her eyes delivered the real message. Know your place. Stay quiet. Don't cause trouble. Aurelia looked up and nodded once, her gaze cool and unyielding. Then, without a word, she reached into her bag and pulled out a second notebook. This one was different, newer, not for observation, but for response. She flipped it open and began to write. Not just notes, not impressions, but a formal, documented record in technical language only aviation professionals understood. Every violation, every protocol breach, every calculated omission. Aurelia Shaw remained in 36B, notebook now tucked back in her bag, her body unmoved, but her mind sharper than ever. She had spent the last hour documenting not just her personal experience, but the technical specifics of each policy violation, each breach of FAA regulations in the crew's conduct, and most importantly, each failure of ethical response by Mila Keene and her team. The weight of the silence around her had not diminished, but it had changed. It no longer pressed against her with helplessness. It now shaped itself into resolve. She had studied enough human behavior to know that systems do not break from protest. They bend from the inside, slowly, through small cracks widened by conscience and evidence. And one such crack was beginning to spread, unnoticed by most, but deeply felt by the one person who had chosen not to look away. In the crew station, Kelsey stared at the service panel with the quiet guilt of someone who had just discovered they had been complicit in a crime. She had returned to the incident log once more, now obsessively scrolling through time-stamped actions that confirmed her suspicion. There had been no legitimate system prompt, no flagged reassignment request, no cause for Mila to override the seating. What there had been, however, was a manual update marked with Mila's user ID, executed at a time when boarding had just begun, and no risk protocol had been triggered. Kelsey's breath caught in her chest as she hovered her finger over the internal crew messaging platform. Her instincts warned her not to speak up, not here, not midair. But her training, ironically shaped by the very programs Aurelia herself had authored for the federal aviation body, urged her to do what was right, even if it came at a cost. Meanwhile, Mila floated down the aisle once more, checking seatbacks and tray tables with the bored precision of someone who believed their authority was unquestionable. When she reached Aurelia's row, she paused, her eyes scanning not just for compliance, but for emotional submission. She expected fatigue, resignation, some signal that her efforts to diminish Aurelia had worked. What she found instead was unsettling. Aurelia looked up at her not with anger, not even defiance, but with a gaze that was level, clinical, almost surgical. Mila's confidence wavered, just for a second. It was not the look of a disgruntled passenger. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and who was quietly dismantling everything Mila thought she had secured. As Mila moved past her, Aurelia reached back into her bag and retrieved a laminated ID tucked deep in a side pocket. She didn't flash it or raise it in protest. She simply placed it flat on her tray table. It bore her name, her photograph, and her title in bold type: Senior Investigator, Federal Aviation Administration, Crisis Protocol Division, Clearance Level 9. She let it sit there for a moment, exposed like a scalpel on a surgeon's tray, not yet used, but present. Not yet revealed, but lethal. Kelsey, returning from the galley, spotted the badge from 3 rows back. She froze. Her breath halted. She blinked twice, then quickly turned away, retreating toward the rear lavatory and locking the door behind her. Inside, her hands trembled. She recognized the title. She'd taken one of Aurelia's compliance courses in her final year of training. The voice had been steady, calm, precise. The same voice now seated in coach, quietly allowing herself to be humiliated for reasons no one had bothered to justify. And Kelsey knew then, with absolute certainty, that this flight wasn't a random occurrence. It was about to become a case study. While Kelsey gathered herself in the restroom, Mila returned to her post at the front, reporting readiness for descent to the captain with that same composed, clipped tone. She had no idea what Kelsey had seen, no idea that the facade she built so confidently was now suspended by a fraying thread of withheld knowledge. She simply adjusted her scarf, straightened her posture, and prepared for landing. Authority, after all, was most dangerous when it believed itself untouchable. Back in 36B, Aurelia lifted the badge, slid it back into her bag, and resumed her posture. She hadn't moved dramatically. She hadn't raised her voice, but a seed had been planted, and she knew someone had noticed. It would be enough, not because it sparked a confrontation, but because it sparked a question. And questions were how revolutions always began, small, quiet, relentless. The captain's voice returned, announcing their approach to San Francisco International. Estimated arrival, 16 minutes early. Outside the windows, faint urban lights began to twinkle like constellations reflected from below. The plane descended gradually, the engines adjusting with a muted growl. Passengers began rousing themselves, stowing electronics, stretching limbs. The curtain between cabins remained shut, but the illusion it represented had already begun to dissolve in the mind of at least one crew member. Kelsey emerged from the restroom, composed but different. Her eyes scanned the cabin as if seeing it for the first time. When she passed Aurelia again, she didn't speak, but her pace slowed, just enough for Aurelia to know that the message had been received. Touchdown came with a soft thud and a ripple of mechanical adjustments beneath their feet. Applause broke out somewhere in the rear, that familiar sound of relief and habit. Aurelia remained still, her fingers lightly pressed against her knees. She waited as the aircraft taxied to its gate, waited as the seatbelt sign chimed off, waited as passengers began standing, fumbling for bags, stretching as if the journey had tested their endurance. She didn't move. Not yet. Mila, preparing to open the front door, was notified that a federal officer had requested to meet the flight on arrival. She furrowed her brow, confused. "Security issue?" she asked. "Don't think so," came the response through her earpiece. "Just says they're waiting for a passenger." Mila shrugged. "Whatever. Probably someone important in first." Mila Keene, still positioned at the threshold of the aircraft, smiled tightly at each departing passenger, oblivious to the shift that had just occurred under her own nose. When Aurelia finally emerged, Mila's eyes flicked toward her automatically, prepared to offer the same mechanical courtesy. But the moment their gazes met, the breath caught in Mila's throat. Behind Aurelia, the agents moved with her, silent but firm. It wasn't the presence of escorts that unnerved Mila. It was the way they looked at Aurelia. Not as a liability, not as a problem, but as a superior. Mila stepped back instinctively, though her mouth twitched toward a smile. "Everything all right, ma'am?" she asked, her voice a brittle mask. Aurelia paused. For a second, she said nothing, letting the silence stretch until it pulled taut between them like wire. Then she said, "No, but it will be." Her voice held no anger, only precision. She turned, leaving Mila frozen in place, her eyes darting between the agents and the space where her control had once stood. Aurelia continued through the concourse without haste, each step a declaration of recovery. The badge, the title, the federal seal, all now visible on the lanyard around her neck, signaled what no one had bothered to ask. The woman they had pushed to 36B, mocked and erased, had not simply been a passenger. She had been the system's architect, not a tourist in the structure, but one of its engineers. And for those who had played the roles of gatekeeper and spectator, that revelation would now echo irreversibly. As she moved past terminals and gate numbers, her phone buzzed with a series of notifications. Her team had received the message she'd sent mid-flight, encrypted and time-released. The complaint was now in motion, filed through internal FAA channels, with full compliance footage already captured by an anonymous observer Kelsey had quietly coordinated just before landing. That footage, combined with Aurelia's report and the system logs she knew how to extract, would initiate an audit. Quietly, efficiently, the kind of audit that didn't ask permission. Aurelia didn't look at her phone. She didn't need to. She knew how this process unfolded. She had designed most of it. Back on the aircraft, Mila closed the cabin door with a hand that trembled slightly. She turned to Carla. "Did you see that?" Carla frowned. "See what?" "The two guys who walked her off. They were feds. I know that logo." Carla shrugged, uninterested. Maybe she works for the government. So what? But Mila wasn't convinced. Her memory itched with the details she had overlooked. The calm posture, the silence, the precision of Aurelia's responses. This hadn't been an average passenger. And that realization began to coil inside Mila like a snake waking in her chest. She hurried to the galley, pulled up the service log, and began scrolling through the system to check for anything she had missed. When she reached her manual seat reassignment entry, she stared at it as if seeing it for the first time. Her fingers hovered over the delete option, but she didn't press it. It was too late. She knew it. Something had shifted. The confidence that had carried her through the flight now cracked, and through it, a chill seeped in. Kelsey, meanwhile, stood outside the gate with her back against a cold white wall, her heart pounding, but her expression calm. She had sent the footage. She had verified the seat reassignment override, and she had submitted her witness statement to the ethics channel, anonymously but accurately. The system might move slowly, but once awakened, it never slept. She spotted Aurelia in the distance, walking toward the elevators, a line of travelers moving around her like water around a stone. She considered calling out, but didn't. Some moments didn't need words. They needed continuation. By the time Aurelia reached the airport security zone, her steps still steady. The events of the flight had already begun the first wave of internal fallout. Her report was tagged for immediate review due to the credentials attached to her signature. It was routed not to a general inbox, but directly to the Vice President of Airline Partnerships and the Chief of Passenger Conduct Oversight. Within 24 hours, the system would begin requesting data, flight logs, internal messages, staff interactions, and video surveillance from gate to gate. And those requests would not be optional. The recollection had begun subtly. First, a lingering image of Aurelia's unwavering eyes, then the echo of her words. No, but it will be. At the time, the phrase had struck Mila as insolent. Now, it rang with prophecy. She had underestimated Aurelia. That alone wasn't unusual. But what was different, what was unraveling her now, was the recognition that she had mocked and discarded not merely a passenger, but a senior figure within the very structure she had assumed to control. The power she had wielded during the flight, the confidence that had fueled her ridicule, now revealed itself for what it was: borrowed, brittle, and deeply mistaken. Kelsey sat across the room, silent, typing a final note into her incident summary. The FAA had followed up with a message requesting clarification on specific timeline details, nothing confrontational, but clearly an early sign of audit movement. She could feel the shift in energy, even though the room remained quiet. There was a difference between before and after. She had witnessed it in the footage, in the manual override record, in Aurelia's measured stillness that now replayed in her head like a loop of unspoken authority. Kelsey hadn't spoken to Mila since disembarking. There was nothing left to say that Mila could deny. The truth, after all, didn't need her permission. In the operations office, a quiet storm had already begun to form. Aurelia's formal complaint had arrived with full documentation. Time-stamped observations, annotated technical violations, references to procedural policy, and an attached assessment of the incident as an active case of systemic abuse of authority masked under customer service discretion. This wasn't a complaint from a disgruntled flyer. This was a forensic indictment filed by an insider, the kind that couldn't be ignored, buried, or delayed, the kind that used the company's own language to demand accountability. The kind of documentation that bypassed media channels and forced action not through outrage, but through evidence. Aurelia had crafted it with clinical precision and submitted it before the plane had even reached the gate. Back at the lounge, Mila stared at her tablet, the last flight record still open. She had read her own words multiple times now, each sentence, once written in assumed authority, now bleeding self-incrimination. Passenger appeared confrontational. Seat reassignment required to maintain order and avoid escalation. The phrasing was sanitized, bureaucratic, believable to anyone who hadn't been there. But the truth was no longer hers to shape. She couldn't retract the manual override entry. She couldn't delete the log that showed she had skipped service. She couldn't erase the security footage of her laughing with Carla while mocking the passenger in question. And she definitely couldn't dismiss the federal title that had hung quietly from Aurelia's lanyard like a sword no one had expected her to carry. Carla walked in, her tone casual, but her eyes alert. "I got a message," she said, handing Mila a printed memo from their supervisor. "They want a call within the hour. Something about follow-up questions on Flight 727. Mila took the paper without speaking. The words didn't surprise her. She had expected the beginning of fallout, but she hadn't known it would come this fast. She stood, smoothed her blouse, and walked past Kelsey without meeting her eyes. The air between them now thickened with a tension that made small talk impossible. Aurelia, meanwhile, had arrived at her hotel, checked into a quiet executive suite on the upper floor, and began her remote debrief. Her laptop lit the room as she spoke in a calm, even tone to a senior ethics officer within the FAA. "Yes," she said. "The reassignment was made pre-boarding. No justification given. No documented risk. No procedural reason. It was selective and unprompted." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight of her words was in their clarity. The culture of complicity on board was not spontaneous. It was orchestrated, or at least allowed, by senior crew. There's audio of mocking behavior. A witness within the cabin has corroborated the pattern. This wasn't an error. This was a purge, masked as policy. Her screen showed the officer nodding, his fingers moving quickly over a keyboard. Understood, Investigator Shaw. We'll move forward accordingly. Outside the airport, a second FAA team arrived unannounced to begin their preliminary inspection of Flight 727's logbooks, crew interviews, and onboard system data. Mila was called to meet them, her jaw tight, her face pale. She recognized one of the agents immediately. She had seen him in training videos. He didn't smile. He introduced himself, then asked, "Can you walk us through your decision to manually reassign a confirmed seat from first class to economy for passenger Aurelia Shaw?" Mila hesitated. There was confusion. The system looked like it had flagged the seat. The agent interrupted gently. "We've already reviewed the time-stamped system logs. There was no flag. The override came from your login at 1742 hours." She opened her mouth, but found no words that could rearrange the truth. In the hotel, Aurelia closed her laptop and leaned back. Her body was tired, but her mind remained crisp, operating with the same focus that had carried her through emergency audits in worse conditions, through hostile boardrooms and political posturing. This wasn't her first confrontation with bureaucratic injustice, but it was personal in a way the others hadn't been. Because this time, she hadn't come to enforce order. She had come as herself, to travel as a citizen. And even in that role, she had been challenged, erased, insulted. Now her identity had been revealed, but it wasn't for validation. It was for consequences. Mila sat alone in a sterile office beside the inspection team, answering questions she had once asked others. Her voice cracked under the pressure of her own miscalculations. "I didn't know who she was," she finally said. "It wasn't meant to go this far." One of the agents tilted his head. "You didn't need to know who she was." Her words, her decisions, and every gesture captured on internal surveillance footage were no longer her tools. They had become evidence. The investigation that began quietly had now gained velocity, pushed forward not by scandal-hungry press or outraged customers, but by something far more precise and unyielding. Internal compliance triggered by the authority of Aurelia Shaw's role and her irrefutable documentation. The auditing team, composed of FAA and airline partnership personnel, cross-referenced her seating override with the flight log timestamps and the internal passenger records, and the findings were stark. There had been no system glitch, no error. Mila had manually reassigned Aurelia without protocol justification pre-boarding, while also initiating a false service restriction entry tagged under non-compliant behavior, despite Aurelia having never once engaged in verbal confrontation or procedural refusal. These weren't missteps. They were fabrications, and fabrications within FAA jurisdiction, particularly when executed by flight leadership, were serious violations that moved beyond internal HR reprimand and into federal scrutiny. The first call Mila received from legal was brief, cold, and conclusive. Her status was updated to suspended with pay pending investigation. Within 48 hours, it became unpaid. Her company badge was deactivated. Her internal account access was frozen. By the end of the week, her employee portal redirected to an error message. She stood in her apartment, which now felt both too small and too exposed, pacing between windows as she reread the language from the final disciplinary letter. It did not accuse her of racism directly, but the terminology was unmistakable. Systemic bias in the execution of authority, misrepresentation of service protocol, procedural abuse of reassignment authority, corroborated by witness testimony and independent evidence. In other words, her judgment, once trusted, was now condemned. What unsettled her most wasn't the fallout, it was the certainty with which it arrived. The system hadn't flinched when punishing her. There had been no plea for context, no allowance for interpretation. It had unfolded like a slow guillotine, precise and mechanical. Meanwhile, Aurelia moved without pause. She returned to Washington for a closed-door debriefing with FAA leadership. The incident on Flight 727 was now logged under active misconduct evaluation, and her role transitioned from target to lead consultant on systemic reform initiatives. She did not approach it with vindication. There was no triumph in watching a system punish those who abused it. But there was necessity. Justice, after all, wasn't about revenge. It was about architecture, building structures that prevented recurrence, not just punished precedent. She presented her findings with composure, outlining not only Mila's behavior, but the cultural scaffolding that had enabled it. She detailed how crew training reinforced authority over empathy, how audit oversight failed to account for bias when masked by vague terminology, and how social cues among staff encouraged complicity rather than correction. She spoke with clarity, and when she finished, the room was quiet, not in resistance, but in recognition. The director of compliance leaned forward. "You're not just reporting a violation. You're pointing out a blueprint for change." Aurelia nodded. That's always been a point. At the airline's headquarters, a second wave of consequences began to ripple. Carla was issued a formal warning for unprofessional conduct, her gossip with Mila captured on security audio, and now cited as creating a hostile environment for passengers. Kelsey, on the other hand, was formally thanked for her integrity and discretion. Her anonymous tip was preserved in the report, but she chose to make herself known, offering a statement that became a central component in the accountability framework now being drafted. Aurelia reached out to her privately, a short message that read, "Courage isn't always loud, but it's always seen." Kelsey didn't reply with words. She sent a single period, a full stop, an acknowledgement. Aurelia understood. Outside the confines of official documents and internal audits, the story began surfacing through quieter channels. A travel blogger who had received the video of Aurelia's removal anonymously posted it without context, but within days, someone who recognized Aurelia's name connected the dots. "That's the FAA investigator who trained half the industry," the post read, and the timeline exploded. News agencies picked up fragments, then confirmed sources. And suddenly, the public knew. The woman who had been removed from first class without explanation was not just a black traveler. They now knew she had helped write the protocols that flight crews were supposed to follow. The irony was too sharp to ignore. The airline scrambled to contain the narrative, releasing a soft statement about an internal review and promising revised training measures. But the internet wasn't interested in promises. It wanted reckoning. Mila, now living in near seclusion, watched the unfolding backlash with a kind of horror that only accompanies the realization that a mistake was not only catastrophic, but public. Her name was never officially released, but employees talk and forums whispered. She could no longer enter an airport without fearing recognition. Her LinkedIn profile was deactivated. She began receiving vague threats from strangers who saw her actions as symbolic of everything wrong in modern air travel. But worse than the threats was the silence from her own colleagues, people who once laughed at her jokes, who toasted with her during layovers, who now pretended they had never known her. Carla stopped responding to texts. Supervisors wouldn't return her calls. She was erased not with malice, but with method, the same way she had once erased Aurelia. Aurelia, when asked by a journalist for comment, offered only a single statement. "Systems fail not because they are broken, but because we refuse to hold their stewards accountable." She didn't name names. She didn't need to. Her work spoke louder than vengeance ever could. New training protocols were rolled out. Crew evaluations added a section on bias intervention. Every seat reassignment now required secondary authorization and a traceable justification. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a beginning. Weeks passed like shadows receding under the weight of a rising sun, each day further dismantling the illusion of permanence that Mila once wore like armor. She had gone from a confident enforcer of unwritten rules to an unintentional case study in everything wrong with unchecked authority, cloaked in routine. Her name wasn't printed in headlines, but it no longer needed to be. Within aviation circles, she had become the parable whispered during training sessions and mentioned at conferences, the cautionary tale of a gatekeeper who didn't check the lock she was holding. At first, Mila resisted the shame, clung to old justifications, told herself she had only followed instinct, and that Aurelia Shaw had provoked something, anything, that warranted her decision. But each justification wilted faster than the last. It was impossible to deny what the system now held as fact. The logs, the footage, the interviews, they weren't stories. They were math. And the math didn't care how she felt. It only cared about the truth. Mila stayed inside for a month after her dismissal, barely speaking, barely eating, watching the seasons begin their transition outside her window while she sat still, unchanging, like a photograph frozen in the wrong year. She thought often of Aurelia, not with resentment, but with disbelief. How had she remained calm? How had she spoken so little and yet said everything? How had she endured the mockery, the erasure, the social exile, and responded not with fury, but with structure? Mila began reading everything she could find about her. Aurelia's published papers, keynote speeches, DI initiatives. She watched videos of her seminars, stunned at the clarity and precision of her voice. She found an old interview where Aurelia said, "The goal of equity is not vengeance. It's clarity. When we understand what systems allow and what they ignore, we can begin to re-engineer them." That line echoed in Mila's mind more than anything else. It was not just insight. It was a blueprint. 3 months later, after multiple failed job applications and one particularly sobering rejection from a regional airline where she had once trained staff, Mila reached out to a local nonprofit that focused on aviation mentorship for underrepresented youth. She didn't expect a response, but one came. They were hesitant, of course. Her past was public enough to raise eyebrows, but she offered to volunteer in the lowest capacity: back office work, file sorting, scheduling. No FaceTime, no leadership, just service. She showed up every day on time, said little, did her job. She didn't expect redemption. She only hoped to make peace with the space she had once corrupted. 6 months in, she was asked to co-facilitate a workshop, not teach, but assist. It was focused on ethics in aviation, and her role was minor: to relay logistical information and set up the room. She accepted, hands trembling. On the morning of the session, as she arranged chairs in the multipurpose room, she noticed a framed quote hanging crooked on the wall. She straightened it without thinking. Then read it. It was Aurelia's. "Authority doesn't make you right. It makes you responsible." Mila stared at it for a long moment, then returned to her task. That same day, Aurelia was preparing to deliver another keynote, this time at a major airline's annual summit on systemic reform. She had been invited not as a whistleblower, but as a reform strategist. Her work on Flight 727 already credited with reshaping internal culture policies across multiple commercial carriers. Her presence had shifted from a name in a report to a force behind new flight crew training modules now required nationwide. But she didn't bask in recognition. She used the platform to refocus attention. Her presentation was titled "Dignity at Altitude: Re-engineering Protocol for Equity." She opened with a video montage, not of the incident, but of flight crews helping passengers, of people being heard, of silence broken by courage. Then she spoke of the bystander effect, of passive harm, of the ripple of complicity. She didn't name Mila, but her story was embedded in every slide. After the presentation, a young black woman approached Aurelia with tears in her eyes. "I thought I had to take it," she whispered, "but you made me realize I can document it, that I can name it." Aurelia smiled. "Naming is how we reclaim space," she said. "Once you can describe the injustice, it can't hide anymore." That night, Mila sat in the back row of a small community forum hosted by the nonprofit. She was not listed on the roster. She came because the speaker was a former FAA consultant addressing young professionals about accountability. Aurelia Shaw was not there in person, but her words were. Her pre-recorded message played across a small projector screen, and Mila listened in silence as her former victim spoke not of punishment, but of systems, stories, and responsibility. "It's easy to write off someone as a villain," Aurelia said, "but the harder question is, what do we do with someone who realizes they were wrong? How do we invite them back into the work without erasing what they did?" Mila swallowed hard. That night, she didn't sleep. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she was falling. She felt like she had somewhere to climb toward. A year later, Mila applied for a position within the same nonprofit. This time, not as a volunteer, as an outreach coordinator. Her resume listed the incident. She didn't hide it. She explained it, described it, owned it. During the interview, the director asked her what she had learned. She replied without hesitation, "I learned that justice isn't just about calling people out. It's about building them back up with accountability at the center. I'm not here to rebuild my career. I'm here to rebuild my conscience and help others do the same." She was hired. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking and subscribing for more gripping narratives that explore justice, power, and redemption. What did you think of the plot? Did the twists and turns keep you hooked? Share your thoughts and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective and connect with readers from around the world. Your feedback helps shape future stories.